There wasn't any.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So, colleagues, before we begin this discussion, I think you have your handout at your desk by now. I just want to underscore what probably is the obvious, which is that we wholeheartedly support the department in its disaster recovery and mitigation activities and in its request for adequate staffing and emergency response so you can do your job, which is an important one. We do need to note that during both subcommittee hearings, there were some issues that we hope will be clarified in today's hearings. And we recognize that this proposal is an ongoing conversation for us. So we welcome Ms. Corstein and also Mr. Brown from the LAO.
Helen Kirstein with the LAO. So as you heard, you have a handout in front of you. If you turn to page 1, we have a brief summary of the proposal. So in January, the governor proposed 77 positions and $35 million from the general fund in 2016-17, and that included $20 million in one-time spending on fire equipment. The proposal also includes a reduction in federal funds authority of $3.9 million. And we would note that this proposal includes 16 different components, so there are a large number of components to the proposal. Those are in 5 areas: fire response, disaster coordination, facilities, technology, and other activities that the department conducts. So as part of our February analysis, we reviewed the governor's proposal and found that the department wasn't able to provide some of the details that would be necessary to assess the proposal and some of those individual components. And so accordingly, we recommend approving a total of $3.1 million of the proposal and 35.5 positions. I would also note that the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee staff recommends approving $17 million and 54.5 positions. If you turn to page 2 of your handout, you'll see a summary table that compares the governor's proposal, the LAO recommendations, and the SBFR staff recommendations side by side, so you can see the differences. And on the following pages, we actually go through each of the individual 16 components of the proposal. So I'm happy to go through those if you would like, or if there are certain proposals, pieces of the proposal that you'd like us to focus on, we're happy to jump to those as well. Shall I start with just going through them in order?
Out of respect for time and in thoughtfulness of some of the conversations that occurred at the subcommittee, I will identify a couple of these line items. If you could talk to us about the, under fire response, the fire apparatus fleet replacement and augmentation, and also fire and rescue branch staffing. And then under disaster coordination, statewide disaster programs, regional response and readiness, law enforcement branch staffing. And I think we might want to focus on those.
Excellent. So if we start with the fire apparatus and fleet replacement and augmentation, that's on page 3. The governor's proposal was $20 million to purchase an additional 62 fire apparatus, basically fire trucks. Our recommendation was to reject the proposal. We noted that the proposal was based largely on a 2004 Blue Ribbon Commission report, and it wasn't clear what the analytical basis of that report was, and it's also quite an old report, so we weren't sure that it was still valid. And the department hadn't done its own independent analysis of the existing resources in terms of fire response. For example, what locals have, what other state agencies have, and they hadn't identified what the gaps are in terms of those pieces of fire equipment. So it wasn't clear to us that they had justified that 62 additional apparatus is the correct number of additional apparatus, or that they would be best positioned to be the entity with those apparatus. Additionally, it wasn't clear where they would be located and how that would happen as well. So we'd recommend in rejecting the proposal. You'll note that the committee staff recommendation is to approve $10 million for 27 of those apparatus.
And I believe that $10 million recommendation is for just replacement, not augmentation.
So the administration's proposal was framed as both replacements and new apparatus. We would note that the replacements, though, are needed because our understanding is that the department used funding that was typically available for replacing engines, and they actually used them over the last couple of years to purchase new engines, which is why they need some funding for replacement engines now, because they use that funding elsewhere. But it's correct that that's what it's intended for.
Okay.
And then the next item I believe that you wanted to discuss was the fire and rescue branch staffing, which is very much related to the fire apparatus. The governor's proposal was $2.5 million in 12 positions to support basically maintenance activities as well as coordination activities with these new fire apparatus. We recommended rejecting this. We felt that the staffing wasn't needed for the new engines because we were recommending rejecting those new engines, and we didn't think the department provided a case to support that their existing staffing was insufficient to meet their needs for their existing workload. You'll note that the staff recommendation here was to approve $1.7 million and 7 positions, which is consistent with the staff recommendation related to the number of engines. If you turn to page 4, if you turn to page 5, since we're skipping, I think, a couple of items, statewide disaster programs. This is one of several different pieces related to disaster coordination, and this one's actually particularly complex. You'll notice that there are actually 5 separate components of this proposal. In total, they add to $5 million in general fund increase, and there's actually a reduction of $3.9 million in federal funds. There's also 2 positions that are proposed as part of this, this particular piece of the proposal. So I'll just walk you through the 5 components very quickly, if I may. And they're actually within 3 different kind of sub-programs, if you will. So it is a little bit complex. The first 2 are really related to recovery public assistance, and this is basically a program that the department uses to process disaster claims. And you'll see that the first one is an increase in general fund of about $3.5 million, and it's a reduction of federal funds of about $3.1 million. The department's rationale for this was an increase in workload that's not eligible for federal dollars, and there are 2 main reasons why this workload wouldn't be eligible. One is that the workload could be for state-only disasters, so basically disasters that weren't declared as federal disasters by the federal government. Also, in some cases, there are federal disasters, but the state hasn't been able to close out those disasters within an 8-year period. And if the state doesn't close them out within 8 years, then they're no longer eligible for federal dollars. The second piece is $188,000 to address a backlog of state-only claims. So there is some backlog of these claims. They're anticipating closing out that backlog over a 3-year period. Then the next 2 components are related to their hazard mitigation program. This is a program that creates and reviews hazard mitigation plans for both the state and local governments. So the first piece is another of these adjustments in state and federal funding. You'll note that it's about $1 million increase in state general fund that's proposed and about $1 million decrease in federal funds authority. The administration has indicated that the reason for this is that they haven't had consistent federal grants, and so they can't rely on federal grant money to fund these activities. And then the next piece is related to staffing. There are 2 positions that are proposed largely for climate adaptation workload. Then the final component is...
One question on that.
Sure.
2 positions, $560,000?
Yeah, I believe there may be some additional costs in there. The proposal only spoke to the 2 positions that I'm aware of. The administration may have more details on that, but I believe it's the only thing that was described in the proposal was the 2 positions. And then the final component was related to the pre-disaster and flood mitigation program. That's a program that awards grants for disaster planning and projects, and that's actually more of a technical adjustment to realign, and it's actually a reduction in general fund spending of $222,000 to realign state and federal funding based on the actual match requirements of that grant program. So we just noted sort of overall that there wasn't a lot of detail. We did recommend approving $188,000 in general fund to address that backlog. We certainly think if there's a backlog of these claims that they need to be addressed. However, just overall in terms of those shifts between state funding and federal funding, we didn't think the department was able to make a compelling case that this was really the appropriate state and federal funding mix. So for example, for the Recovery Public Assistance Program, we noted that this is actually a very large increase in their general fund support, about 65% increase for that program. And it wasn't clear that the increase in workload and new workload was that large. They didn't provide data to substantiate that. And it wasn't also clear that they've seen just a tremendous backlog or redirection. While those things may have happened, we didn't receive any data that substantiated that kind of increase to necessitate a $3.5 million increase in general fund. Similarly, with the hazard mitigation piece, that additional $1 million of state general fund, the administration indicated that that was needed because there wasn't consistent federal funding. While this may be the case, when we asked for data on the past awards that the state had received, actually there was an increase in the last year or two in terms of the amount, and it was just aggregated by state and local, so we understand some of that, a large portion of that, or potentially all of it may have gone to locals, but it just wasn't clear to us that that there's a reason why the state couldn't access those grant funds. Then we also noted just on those positions that it wasn't clear to us what role that the department was going to have in terms of climate adaptation and how those additional positions would be utilized. So we'd note also the staff recommendation was to approve the $188,000 in general fund. And if you turn to page 6, the regional response and readiness. This is also related to disaster coordination. The governor's proposing $2 million in 13 positions. This group basically interacts with locals, state, federal government related to various disasters. Our recommendation was to reject this piece of the proposal as well. The department had some anecdotal evidence about increased threats driving this need. However, there wasn't any data that they were able to provide that really substantiated that and the justification for these 13 positions. And then our rationale was very similar with the law enforcement branch staffing increase. The governor's proposal was $1.7 million in 6 positions in this area. We recommended rejecting for very similar reasons. The staff recommendation was $1.1 million in 4 positions. And
all I asked you.
Yes.
Then committee members, just to recognize that out of this long list that is provided to us in our notes here, there is agreement between finance, LAO, and staff recommendation on just about everything else with some minor variations. But then maybe the last 2 items where there's some difference you might want to address would be under the other category, FEMA and emergency operations incident support training.
Sure. I can provide a brief summary of those. The Federal Emergency Management Program, it's on page 10 of your handout. So the governor's proposing $700,000. And essentially what the governor's proposing is replacing some in-kind match that the state's been providing with a cash match, and this will allow them to perform additional activities. We're recommending rejecting this because they just didn't justify really what those activities were and why they were needed. So certainly they'll be able to do more if they have additional cash, but there wasn't a clear justification there. And then the next component, emergency operations incident support training, the governor was proposing $169,000 for additional specialized training. We recommended rejecting that as well. We noted that there wasn't clear what this additional training, specialized training would be and what the additional benefits would be from that training. On both of those items, the staff recommendation was also to reject.
Thank you, Ms. Kirstein, for walking us through that thicket of information and data. Senator Roth, this was heard in your committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe just a basic question on the recovery public assistance. Why are the federal disaster activities not closed out within the 8-year time frame that the federal government specifies? Apparently they think 8 years is enough, for them anyway. And what do we need to do as a state to try to align our recovery timelines with the federal government? 2 questions.
All right. Brendan Murphy, Department of Finance. Thank you for the question, Senator. I think the first part is that the federal government actually recently changed to 8 years. Historically, there was no time limit, recognizing that most of these projects rebuild public infrastructure, which is not done overnight. And quite frankly, when the state and the administration made comments back a few years ago about the length of time, it was decided that 8 years was, I think from our perspective, arbitrary, and that there was no real hard evidence to suggest that 8 years was a time frame in which the projects could be closed out or not closed out. It was just made because, quite frankly, that's the length of the appropriations period that the federal government wanted. Their initial appropriation is good for 8 years. Therefore, if you make closeout done in 8 years, frankly, there's less accounting on their end. So at that point in time, we have all made comments that was very arbitrary and doesn't seem to jive with the reality of how long it takes to rebuild things like freeways, overpasses, things, huge public buildings. When you're talking like the '89 earthquake, Oakland City Hall, where they moved on immediately, but it still took 9 years to complete the project and to do the redesign and to get everything through. So that's just, one project where if you're, 25% match of a $250 million project is still a fair match for the city to come up with. Even if the California Disaster Assistance Act kicks in 18.75%, you're talking about 6.25% match. And then after that, you compound those things. So it really, to get to the 8-year comment, that's a very arbitrary number and something that, yes, we have set as a benchmark and we'll strive to, but I don't know how realistic that is on big disasters where you're talking about major infrastructure projects.
So what portion of the $3.5 million is attributable from a budget standpoint to federal disasters that are not closed out? Is that a fair question?
Maybe a fair question, but honestly, I don't have that in front of me. I think the reality that it's a blended answer that includes both state-only disasters and the federal funds displacement. But
well, then that leads to my next question on the state-only disasters, and I know we have those that don't align with the federal requirements. With respect to the budget and the $3.5 million, are there subcategories that list out state disasters that we're working on currently that are included in the $3.5 million? And then is there another, if so, is there another category that anticipates, those that we don't know, but we can't know what we don't know?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes and no, because we don't know what we don't know. The first part is yes, we have a listing of all state disasters that we have, and I think we actually provided that. In addition to the listing of all state disasters, the folks that we're talking about in this branch actually transition. So while they are managing the ongoing projects at the same time, when a new disaster comes up, they immediately transition as the primary source for Recovery Act work immediately. So these folks are both closing out old projects and maintaining project management oversight of prior disasters at the same time that they transition into a new disaster. So the unit itself is never without work, if that makes sense, unless we go on a long streak with no disasters.
And we're largely talking labor here, personnel, and so I haven't seen the state list. It would be helpful to know how many ongoing state projects we have, what the total number of resources that we have devoted to this particular activity is, what percentage of those resources are working on state projects, and then normally I'm used to a workload analysis, and maybe it doesn't fit here because we're talking about disasters, but I mean, do you have 2.5 disasters per person, or is that an intelligent question?
It is, and from your military background, I understand the question. It doesn't fit here because we do have a blend, like on every disaster I have a blend of engineers as well as administrative personnel that are going to go out to do the effective management, the money aspects, the reality there. So it doesn't kind of fit nicely as if we have one disaster, do we need one engineer or do we need 5 engineers? And what is that right mix to manage the overall program?
Well, and one last comment, Mr. Chair, and then I will close my lips. I seem to recall from the subcommittee hearing that these aren't new folks. that this is an existing workforce that has long served within OES, and this is simply a cleanup of a budget problem, maybe budget management inside the organization that has existed for some time.
Yes, sir. Can you don't know, I think he's referring to the fact that he used to be the deputy director of OES.
And speak to that, because some of my colleagues were not present during the subcommittee, and that may or may not affect what they think about this proposal.
The original split on all of these positions was a 75% general fund, or a federal fund split with a 25% general fund. And the intent was that you have big programmatic disasters and you work in a linear fashion. And so you work on a federal disaster and you have this fund split. And then you have some very small state-only disasters that a small cadre could essentially work off of and simply charge their general fund only time. And quite frankly, when we had Loma Prieta and Northridge, and then the subsequent 03 wildfires and the 97 floods all open at a federal level at the same time, we didn't see the effects of quite frankly, a bad budget plan. Unfortunately, when we did see the effects, as we did our due diligence and closed out those federal projects and got done with them as quickly as possible, we quickly started to realize that kind of old methodology of how this would continue on wasn't happening. So the state disasters were running, and I have a historical, so I don't have the actual for you right now, but they run about 40 open state disasters at a year. We did have a peak that was significantly higher because of a lack of resources to close them out. But they run about 40 a year that are open. And so we took the 40 that a year open, and then you decrease the amount of available federal funds, and your fund split on that 75-25 idea quickly shrank, and so it came close to about 50-50. So the department has been dedicating general fund from other fund sources to make this work for a number of years. As I mentioned,
Just on that point, sometimes we've had to dip into our reserve to cover.
yeah, and what that was is a reprioritization. So, in all honesty, we reprioritized. This is, recovery from any disaster is the top priority of the department, and we reprioritized from other things to make the budget work, period. And this really is a reflection of the fact that we've been reprioritizing for all those years, and when things were bad, we can't come in and say, hey, we need more general fund because our old fund splits that we used to have don't work anymore. That's just not it wasn't a realistic ask then. So, what you have here is what we believe is a realistic ask for how this department should move forward and how we should continue to respond to disasters into the out years.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roth. And I think it'd be appropriate to allow you an opportunity to respond to Ms. Kirstein's assessment that in many of these areas, there just hasn't been a substantiation of the need. You give a fine, broad overview as to why you're bringing forward the suggested 30, I think it's close to 35 million, 35.1 million, but we're hearing from the LAO it's just in nuts and bolts, not substantiated. I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, I'll let my colleague get into kind of the specifics. I think the analyst and the chair have highlighted some of the key differences in the packages before you. I think I would just note, I think Brendan did a great job talking about kind of some of the structural elements within this department, kind of right-sizing it. I'd also note that we are seeing an uptick in wildfires, some of it related to the drought. Some of you have probably had the unfortunate experience of having a disaster within one of your districts. So we still support our proposal for the funding to help address some of those issues and to have the adequate resources to adequately respond to disasters in the state.
Mr. Murphy, you want to add to that?
Yes. If you don't mind, I'll just kind of quickly cover it. I don't want to take more time than you want me to, so feel free to cut me off, Mr. Chair. As far as the fire apparatus and fleet replacement augmentation, the $20 million that's proposed both funds $10 million in replacement and is proposed to fund $10 million in new. And I just wanted to give you a little background on the way mutual aid works in the state and why these engines are where they are. I'm not good on math, I'll be the first to admit that. So I think it's 65 years now or so we've had the mutual aid engine program running at both the Office of Emergency Services and its predecessor agency, the Civil Defense. And in that, since we signed the mutual aid compact, The idea here is that when you have to draw from resources and there's no place else to go, we can send, in relation to fires, we can move these trucks. They are staffed locally. The state does not pay for any of the staffing, except when we call them into use and move them in to serve our purposes to actually respond to wildfire. You heard mention of kind of old reports. Well, the Blue Ribbon Commission reports, for those of you that have ever had to deal with fire, know that these folks take them very, very seriously and continue to update them and tweak numbers and look at how they came to recommendations over a series of years. Where we're at now, in relation to the fleet increases, I just want to point out a few kind of facts. So for equipment requests through the mutual aid system to the Office of Emergency Services, in 2012, there were 134 equipment requests that went unfilled. In 2015, there were 1,585 equipment requests that went unfilled. That is a substantial increase, I think, by anybody's metrics, tenfold over a 4-year period. That really is the crux of why we proposed to build out of and to continue the engine purchases. I won't belabor the point, but that's a huge increase of unfilled needs on the equipment side that we feel like adding more engines will help us fill.
Ms. Christine, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well,
Or more appropriately, would you please respond to that?
absolutely. So based on the data we received, there were, I think, about 33,000 requests in total. So while this last year was particularly bad in terms of fires, and there were more needs certainly than in other years, even with that particularly tough fire year, really it was a very small fraction of those requests that went unfilled. And so we certainly think that while there's certainly value in additional trucks, it's not clear to us that those trucks would be needed at this level on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Colleagues? Yes, Senator Morlock and Senator Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This report is dated today, so we're just getting it. So
Yes.
I'm kind of stunned on 2 levels. The first is that the LAO would be so candid. The OES was not able to provide the details necessary to assess the merits of many of the individual components. So it's like, wow, you're getting some straight talk. But 2, it's about one of our departments. And and this seems, in my new career here, this is foreign to me to get statements like this. I wouldn't see it for county departments when I was a supervisor. I think instead of kicking anybody, I'm just going to say my vote will reflect the LAO recommendation, and that's where I'm at.
Okay, thank you, Senator Morlock. And I had made my comments before we began the presentation and the conversation because this is a delicate issue area. We're talking about the public safety. And so I know for a fact no one among us takes this lightly, but at the same time, we're trying to assess to the best that we can what is an appropriate amount of investment and use of general fund dollars here. So if you look at the bottom line, because there are many, many details and moving parts to all of this, but on page 19 on the spreadsheet, the Department of Finance is recommending $35,180,000 in general fund investment. You can see that the LAO has slashed it by about 90%, just $3 million, and that our committee staff has really much split it down the middle, though in fine detail as to how that bottom line figure of about 17 million adds up. But it's about half of what the administration is asking, but significantly more than what the LAO is. So that is the parameter of our conversation right now. Is there any? Yes, Senator Nielsen.
Mr. Chairman, I'm troubled too, because of all parts of the budget, this is, I consider, the most critical. Public safety is number 1. And this is an area where we are dealing with natural disasters, and we had some cataclysmic ones the last couple of years. Now, with the greater rainfall, maybe not so much this year, but there is also a lot of fuel still out there, and I'm worried. But when I hear the explanations for the justifications for the 35,180, it's just inadequate. This is kind of really shotgunning it, and there's no comfort. The ledge analyst has raised some very good points. I can't accept their figure either, because that seems way too low to me. And when we have these disastrous situations, we've got to react very quickly. So I'm discomforted by both ends. The staff recommendation down the middle gives me some more comfort. We do have a reserve for economic uncertainties, and this is certainly the kinds of uncertainties that fund was originally conceived for many decades ago. But we would sure hope, as this conference committee proceeds, that some more hard questions and answers, hard questions can be continued to be asked, and substantiated answers could be provided us. It's such a critical area.
Thank you, Senator. No other questions, comments. I'm going to take a motion from Senator Wolk on the staff recommendation, which has that bottom line figure of $16,955,000. We do want to allow for public comment. Do we have any? Please step forward.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, John Moffitt on behalf of the Orange County Fire Authority. I wanted to speak specifically in support of the governor's proposal on the fleet replacement and augmentation. Am I here today because if OES gets more money, that means we'll get more engines? No, we don't know that. That's a needs assessment that will happen later. But we are big supporters of the mutual aid system in the state. We know we benefit when OES puts more engines out on the road, that when the time comes, when there is a disaster, the entire fleet that's at the disposal of OES can come and help us out. That's important because in Orange County, there is no CAL FIRE. Orange County Fire Authority is CAL FIRE, takes care of the state lands in Orange County. Secondly, I think it's important to note, because of this mutual aid system, which is incredibly efficient in sharing resources throughout the state, the LAO noted that there were requests that went unfilled. Those requests only come in when a local fire department or local emergency responder has exceeded their local capacity to deal with a disaster. That's when they call on OES, and those are the times when the team needs to come together in the mutual aid system, and so we support the $20 million that the governor proposed for the budget.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment? So before we take our vote, just to make note specifically with regard to fire response, the staff recommendation is for half of the $20 million requested. So as mentioned by the Legislative Analyst's Office, that would be for replacement of fire apparatus fleet. And then with regard to fire and rescue branch staffing, this would be about proportional to that funding figure, so 7 as opposed to the 12. So again, I think this is a thoughtful recommendation. I understand the LAO's analysis here, but I think it might be a bit too severe, and so I will be supporting the staff recommendation. We do have a motion. There's, yes, Senator Glazer.
Mr. Chairman, do we know what the Assembly has done on this to understand more clearly whether this conversation will continue on beyond this
It's a
hearing?
reasonable question. Given the complexity of this, I don't know exactly what they're doing, but I would place a very strong bet that it will not be identical to what we're doing. So this will continue in conference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I would certainly argue that we need to deal with it further in conference. I'm uncomfortable with this lower figure myself, and would hope that we can get some more convincing evidence to justify an increase beyond what we're going to vote here today. That will certainly be something I will argue for in committee, but if it's going to be hard-pressed, I'm saying, to the administration, unless we get some more evidence that's substantial, that's going to make it pretty tough.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. And Senator Glazer, to answer your question more specifically, the Assembly approved the entire administrative package. Thank you. So again, this will, if this motion passes today, this will be continued in conference. Senator Pavley.
And not to belabor this, I'll be supporting the, I guess, thoughtful compromise from the Senate proposal. and it'll go over to conference committee. But I was just wondering if anyone could clarify for me. I get when there's a large wildfire in Southern California is not out of the drought, and living in my constituencies in the Santa Monica Mountains and Santa Clarita and Simi Valley, all the areas that burn are in my district for some reason. So this is going to be an ongoing issue. But what generally happens in counties that have a countywide fire department is we pay a lot of additional money for equipment. We rent super scoopers that usually were there for 3 months a year and now almost year round. We assess ourselves additional amounts on our property tax for extra staffing, extra people, because generally speaking, at least at the beginning of any firefight before there's that mutual aid agreement, you're somewhat on your own. So we've been stepping up as taxpayers, paying for what we think we need to protect property and lives and everything else. So I've sort of come to the realization over time in this state, there's a lot of areas that don't want to spend money on these. They want the state to cover it in the general fund. They don't want to, they can't approve any tax increases to enhance their own local fire operations. They want the state to do it. And so then those of us who are living in areas trying to be responsible for our fair share and making sure that our fire departments have adequate staffing and adequate airplanes and all the other kinds of equipment they need, we're sort of paying twice. We're paying for everyone else's through the general fund, and we're being responsible and paying to meet our own needs. And that's what's happening in LA County and some other counties. But not everyone is paying the same per capita for this very important resource. So I'll be supporting this today, but it would be interesting at some point in time to see how that discrepancy is gone, because what's happened, partially due to climate change and drought issues, is that the more rural areas or areas that don't want to pay taxes, they used to have volunteer fire departments, and they would have seasonal CAL FIRE workers that would work through the summers during the fire seasons, but they're now year-round. The state is paying for that. Some areas paying a lot more than others because we're asked to pay twice. So that's a political commentary, but I think it's something to watch as the shift and having more likelihood of greater fires year-round due to weather patterns and everything associated with climate change is going to be the new reality.
Thank you, Senator Pavley. The motion is to adopt the proposed Senate package. Call the roll, please.
Leno?
Aye.
Nielsen? Aye. Allen? Aye. Anderson? Aye. Bell? Aye. Block? Aye. Glazer? Aye. Hancock? Aye. Mitchell? Aye. Monning? Aye. Morlock? Wynn? Pan? Aye. Pavley? Aye. Roth? Stone? Wolk?
The motion passes 12-3.
If I might make a note, the rural areas are already paying at state responsibility area fee a very substantial amount, so we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Senator.